So somebody that was there, somebody that saw the front line of this trial, what do you think the fallout will be now that Code and Dawkins have been charged with just kind of one simple count of bribery?
Well, I think throughout the trial there was a lot of evidence and testimony that didn't paint a very pretty picture for the state of college basketball. Whether or not that's going to have whether or not that's going to have far-reaching implications is still, I think, too early to tell. The NCAA said it's going to try to get the information that was presented as evidence and testimony from the prosecutors, but it's not clear they'll be able to get that anytime soon, as there's likely to be appeals, and there were appeals in the last case. I think, one of the key things that we have to remember about this trial is a lot of the details about Sean Miller and Will Wade and some of the other stuff that's going on did come in through wiretap calls and secretly recorded video meetings. So, I mean, you had people on these recordings talking about payments to players and alleged deals that they had, but there wasn't a lot of specific evidence to back those up. So, whether or not those will lead to anything, I think, is still an open question.
So it's interesting. In the end, Dawkins is found guilty on 2 of 6 charges, Code on 1 of 4. In their last sentencing trial, people maybe thought they were going to get years. They end up with a few months. Is the reason kind of for that disparity for as to maybe what was expected versus what actually happened? Is it because do people not buy the base level argument that these schools are being defrauded?
Well, when it comes to sentencing, that's in the hands of the judge. And there are some guidelines that they have to follow, the federal guidelines they're supposed to follow. And there's a formula by which they, based on the allegations that that the prosecutors will try to present what they think is the likely what the likely sentence should be. I have to imagine, given what happened in the last trial, where both Dawkins and Code got 6 months for their charges in that case, that we can look at that as an example of what they might get here. Or it may not even be much more. They may be able to run those sentences concurrently. I think we still have to wait until we get the report from the prosecutor's office of what they're pushing for. I think it was telling, though, that the jury had some difficulty buying this idea that the schools themselves were actual victims of this corruption. There was one charge in particular against both individuals for this thing called honest services fraud, which simply put is when you do something that's corrupt that deprives an employer of the honest services of its employee, in this case assistant basketball coaches to a school, that can be considered a crime, a federal crime under certain conditions. And the prosecutors really tried to push that the schools here were being victimized because they were being opened up to potential NCAA sanctions, and that these assistant coaches were going around doing things that were technically in violation of their employment agreements. Therefore, that was wire service or honest services fraud. However, the jury just didn't seem to buy that, and they acquitted both men on that account. And there were a couple questions they sent to the judge that I think were interesting. And one of the questions they sent to the judge was asking for more explanation of the law, whether or not the schools could be willfully ignorant to what was going on, whether they could still be victims. And I think that was telling about how the deliberations were going. That being said, it's impossible to tell without actually, those jurors coming forward and saying what happened.
Talking to Zach Zaggar at Zach Zaggar on Twitter. Senior reporter at Law 360, covering sports law, filling us in on this college basketball scandal case. So, Zach, one interesting thing to me was before this trial that just wrapped up, the defense was talking a big game about how they were going to expose everybody. They were going to burn it to the ground. And then not only did they not do that, but right afterwards, as Dawkins is walking out of the courtroom, he takes the complete opposite stance where he starts immediately talking about how he thinks the whole case is BS, and he decided to protect these college coaches. If you had to guess or kind of surmise, why does that kind of change come about?
Yeah, well, I think what happened was, first of all, they had tried to make Arizona coach Sean Miller and LSU coach Will Wade testify in the trial, and the judge denied those requests by the defense to force them to come to testify in person. So they didn't have the ability to do that. And I think what they said after the trial is consistent in the sense that the defense here, at least in Dawkins' case, was that he may have paid some players. In fact, he admitted, I've paid players, I've funneled money to players, I've given money to coaches with the intent that the coaches would just give that money to the players. But he said that he never actually bribed the assistant coaches. That's what he was charged with here. In order to be found guilty of bribery, you have to be shown that, like, you gave money to someone with the specific intent that they would do something corrupt in return. And so he was saying, I gave money to some coaches, but it was meant to go to the players. I'm not charged with bribing players. Therefore, there's not evidence here that I'm guilty of bribing the coaches. And I think the jury did kind of look at that, and I thought the defense put on a good defense. Dawkins testified on his own behalf. They had a story that they put together of why these payments were being made and what was going on here. Again, it didn't paint a pretty picture for the NCAA or the state of college basketball in the sense that it painted a picture that there was a lot of backroom dealings and illicit payments being made. But he tried to say that didn't show that there was bribes here to coaches. And in the end, though, the jury found him and Code guilty of conspiring to commit bribery, and they also found, as you said, Dawkins guilty of account of actually paying a bribe.
Zach, did you hear the tapes?
I did, yes.
How much was Will Wade on there?
Oh, wow.
He didn't come up very much during the trial. There was one tape. It was a video of Emmanuel Book Richardson, the former assistant out at Arizona, talking about about the recruitment for LSU player Naz Reid, and he mentioned something about Wade having a deal to pay Wade, I think it was $300,000 or something, to come to LSU, and he was bragging that if he had half that much money, he could get him to come to Arizona. Now, that was really the only big moment in which Will Wade was mentioned, and like I said before, we have to take things with a grain of salt. We didn't hear from Will Wade on any tapes. We didn't hear from Sean Miller on any tapes. This was all other guys bragging about it, and it was in the context of them trying to pitch their services to these, or allegedly pitch their services to these co-conspirators to be able to get players. So was he bragging a little bit? Maybe. Was he saying that, like, was he just saying that just to say that? It's hard to tell. There wasn't a lot of evidence to back that up. I think the only reason that came in was it was trying to show this overall bribery and corruption scheme on the part of Dawkins, Code, and the other co-conspirators.
From your experience, what happens with this evidence now? What happens with the tapes and the video?
Well, like I said, the NCAA is trying to get their hands on that so they can use that as evidence in potential sanctions cases. What stems from that, it's hard to say.
Will that be easy to do? Like, from the NCAA standpoint, will that be easy to get that evidence?
No, and that's what I kind of mentioned earlier, is that the prosecutor's office, they kind of want to keep that, and there's a possibility that if this goes, if these convictions get appealed and the convictions get overturned, that they would have to retry the case. They want to keep all that evidence so that they can be able to retry the case, and they don't want all that out in public. And the exhibits and things within the case do become public eventually, but not immediately. So it's not like court documents that are immediately posted online and are available to the public. So we'll see if the prosecutors will have to cooperate with the NCAA to see if anything comes of that. But I imagine what is going to happen, though, is when you have all these details emerge, it draws more attention. So I'm sure coaches that were mentioned in this case will draw more scrutiny and more attention from the NCAA enforcement staff as well as others. So that's something we should watch out for. And all the schools that are involved are probably all doing internal reviews right now, looking at what happened and making sure that nothing corrupt did happen and that nothing happens in the future. So,
last one, senior reporter from Law 360, Zach Zaggar, joining us here. Did you get an idea of how many schools were involved by being in the courtroom?
Well, it involved in this case. I mean, there was some evidence where they posted text messages and emails where Dawkins was touting his connections at a number of schools, including Michigan State, Louisville, Arizona, Creighton, Oklahoma State, University of South Carolina. But again, like I said, it's hard to say whether or not that meant that there were actual relationships in the sense that he was arranging any kind of bribes or payments, or those were just like networking people he had in his network.
Yeah.
The schools that were specifically involved in this were the schools where the assistant coaches were working, and that was there was 3 assistant coaches that pled guilty, and that was Anthony Bland at University of Southern California. There was Lamont Evans, who worked at University of South Carolina, and then Oklahoma State University, and there was also
Chuck
Brooke
Pearson,
Richardson in Arizona. So those were the schools that were specifically involved in this case.
Zach, this is exactly what we were looking for this morning. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, no problem. Anytime.
Thanks so much, man.
Zach Zaggar checking in from New York, where he's a senior reporter up at Law 360,
Our
covering
boy looks
sports
pretty
law.